Shrewd deal-makers, OPEC learned how to play the oil game of the West to their advantage. Now that they held all the cards, they only had to figure out how to play with each other. Some preferred to play by their own rules. The burning oil fields of Kuwait underscored a bitter lesson to be learned. The very essence that could bring untold power and riches to the world could also sow the seeds of its destruction. With the rise of the environmental conscience, the question must be asked, does big oil have a future? Based on the Pulitzer Prize-winning book by Daniel Yergin, The Prize. Corporate funding for the prize is provided by the people at Paine-Webber. At Paine-Webber, our most important investment is an investment in relationships. Additional funding is provided by the David H. Koch Charitable Trust, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and the annual contributions of viewers like you.
In a span of 20 years, war has ravaged the oil-rich Middle East 4 times. In 1991, an Allied army fought to drive Iraqi invaders from Kuwait. When the Gulf War was over, the Iraqi army had been shattered, but the oil fields of Kuwait were in flames. Western oil men had come to depend upon the petroleum of the Persian Gulf.
For 40 years, oil men have lived with the knowledge that 60% of the world's oil reserves are in the Gulf region, in that very volatile, rather feudal area where modern forces are constantly clashing with the old religious habits.
The horror of the war is etched in the memory of Kuwait's former oil minister.
When you have your young people killed, when you have young women raped, when you see for pure hatred oil fields are set afire, these are something very graphic in the memory of Kuwaitis.
The Gulf War and the fate of Kuwait were the result of historical forces that were set in motion 20 years earlier. For more than a century, Kuwait and the Gulf states had been protected by the British. But in 1971, to the dismay of some emirs, there was an abrupt and fateful change in the balance of power.
Our defense planning will be based on the withdrawal of all our forces from the Persian Gulf to take effect by the end of 1971.
The British withdrawal east of Suez left a clear military vacuum in the region, and to some extent a political vacuum. The Americans were ill-suited to fill that vacuum, partly because of our connection with Israel, and largely because the American public did not want to acquire any additional responsibilities around the world, and the American public determines foreign policy.
So, to fill the vacuum and counter the Soviets, President Nixon turned to the Shah of Iran. Armed by the West, the Shah was to safeguard the Gulf and its oil.
It is significant to note that of all of the areas in the world which pose a potential threat to peace in the world, that Iran is in a very key central area.
The Shah was eager to become the region's policeman, perhaps too eager.
Remember, this was the King of Kings. This was a man who insisted on being called His Imperial Majesty. Iran was an empire. Well, in fact, Iran was a nation. It was the Persian nation. But the Shah saw it and built it up as an empire. It was this kind of grandiose ambition that eventually led to his downfall.
The $100 million that the Shah lavished on his own coronation not only offended fundamentalist religious leaders at home, but led many abroad to question his judgment.
He tried to identify himself with the great kings and emperors who built vast Persian empires in the past. And he wanted to show the world that Iran's past glory and Iran's future plans did give him every reason to hope for the great civilization, which was his dream, his vision of the future of his country.
The Shah wanted German industrial strength and English pomp and circumstance.
The Shah of Iran intended to show the world that he had grand ideas and plans for developing Iran, which naturally had to be fueled by the petroleum and its revenue.
To finance his ambitions, the Shah was forcing rapid increases in Iranian oil output. But the King of Kings had no power over the price of oil.
It is with money from oil that we are building up our country, that we are building the dam, that we are promoting agriculture, industry, and the rest of it. We are getting less money for oil, which is something that is exhausted at the end. It's not eternal, an eternal source of supply. 20 years, 30 years, 50 years time, it will finish. In many cases, this is the only source of wealth of some countries.
Arab oil-producing countries also felt that the West was getting a free ride.
The entire demand and the expectation in the West of cheap energy, it fueled industrial civilization. The West took this availability of cheap supplies as its own birthright. It was going to be there. The Arabs and the Iranians, as the lingo of the time had it, had no choice. They couldn't drink it. They had to sell it. And this was the expectation, that these people would sell at our prices, that there would be no consequences for the prosperity and for the autonomy and the independence of the West.
When Sir Peter Walters became BP's chairman, it was still half owned by the British government, and oil companies were the focus of rising nationalism.
Morning, Arthur.
Are you?
Under the old concession system, BP owned its oil outright.
The old concessional system and equity crude was really what BP was all about until perhaps the mid-60s, early 70s, when life changed. But BP was based on Iran and Iraq and Kuwait, and the whole system of being probably the best in the world at finding crude, and a company whose fortunes were totally dependent on that old system.
Much of BP's oil came from the small city-state of Kuwait. Located at the head of the Persian Gulf, it sits on 10% of the world's oil supplies. For many years, the driving force behind Kuwait's emerging oil industry was Sheikh Ali Khalifa al-Sabah, a member of Kuwait's royal family.
Kuwait was a poor country and a very poor region. To a certain degree, we were better than some of the countries around us in terms of being able to engage in trade and pearl fishing.
For years, pearl fishing kept the Kuwaiti economy afloat. And then when the Japanese developed cultured pearls at the end of the 1920s, Kuwait's economy was devastated. Oil transformed Kuwait. In 1938, BP and the American company Gulf struck oil. Kuwait's wealth began to build up, but so did its resentment of foreign companies.
My generation was, if you grew up in the Middle East in the 50s and the 60s, the oil companies were monstrous bloodsuckers. Get rid of them, and a brand new world shall be created in the region. The cartel, the Seven Sisters, they had the magic, they had the power, they had the force. And so there was this tremendous sense of these overbearing, powerful entities. And of people feeling at the mercy of these companies.
Gulf and BP had invested treasure and emotions for decades in Kuwait. We thought of ourselves and the Kuwaitis together building something that was important to both of us, and we thought that we were part of that team, we were part of that family. It was a great disappointment, and it was a shock, really an emotional shock to realize they didn't think of it as family at all. They thought they had been exploited.
The activities of Western oil companies meant a large expatriate community. Too often they made Kuwaitis feel like foreigners in their own country.
The attitude of the foreign oil companies, especially a company like British Petroleum, was to treat the nationals as something below their own nationals. You may not believe it, but as late as 1959, the Habara Club, which is a senior staff club in Ahmadi, the Kuwaiti engineers were not allowed to become members.
It took the personal intervention of the man who is today the Emir of Kuwait to end the club's discrimination against Kuwaitis. But the resentment lingered on.
It didn't seem to us, I think, that we necessarily were doing the wrong thing. But looking back, one realizes more and more, I think, what the seeds of nationalism were leading to.
People felt that important decisions affecting their own life and their own country was being made in London or Pittsburgh. This they did not accept and wanted these decisions, for good or for bad, to be taken by themselves under their own political system.
I always believe that the price of oil in the short term is decided politically. In the long term, the economical factors will prevail. And this is what happened in the past,
And this is what's happening today.
At a traditional family engagement party, the man introducing the bride to the groom is Sheikh Ahmed Zaki Yamani. Saudi Arabia's oil minister was a natural matchmaker.
Sheikh Yamani was the quintessential character of the 1970s. It was no longer the simple person of the desert. He was a child of the peninsula who had been educated in the West, who was going to cut a better deal for the Arabs of the West, and who knew the tricks of the West. This was Yamani.
Ahmed Zaki Yamani combined the old and the new. He took over as oil minister at a young age. He had an extraordinary patience in negotiations. And as one oil man said in the early 1970s, he drives you to the wall with sweet reasonableness.
Like the Shah of Iran, Yamani believed the oil prices the West was paying were unreasonably low. At a conference in Tehran, hosted by the Shah, the oil companies were brought to the negotiating table and forced to increase the price of oil by 35 cents a barrel.
The oil-producing countries themselves were able to ask for a seat at that table because they, at this time in the early 1970s, were beginning to say, the oil's mine. I can produce it how I want to produce it, develop it the way I want to, and if you don't so agree, you, the oil companies, I'm going to exercise my own control over that.
The Tehran Agreement gave the oil producers for the first time the right to join the oil companies in fixing the price of oil.
Their hand became strengthened by the simple realization that oil demand itself was outstripping the potential growth in available supply. This meant the power was shifted to the hands of those who owned the oil and who produced the oil, becoming a seller's market.
This shift in the marketplace was an ominous development for Western interests.
The growing and insatiable demand of the Western industrial nations for oil, coming on top of a tightening world oil market, meant that the oil exporters were acquiring a new form of power, a political power, and a political power that could be transformed into something called the oil weapon.
Egypt's President Anwar Sadat planned to use the oil weapon against Israel. King Faisal of Saudi Arabia promised his support, and on U.S. television warned of what might happen.
We do not wish to place any restrictions on our oil exports to the United States. But as I mentioned, America's complete support of Zionism against the Arabs makes it extremely difficult for us to continue to supply the United States petroleum needs or even to maintain our friendship with the United States.
Washington ignored the omens.
Saudi Arabia had tried to warn the United States throughout the spring and summer of 1973 that if war came, and if the United States helped Israel to a great extent, there would be a violent reaction in the Arab world, and that oil would be used as a weapon in this war. The American government chose not to believe those warnings.
In October 1973, on the Jewish holiday of Yom Kippur, Egyptian forces stormed across the Suez Canal. Syrian forces attacked in the north. Caught by surprise, the Israelis reeled back. In Vienna, OPEC countries were preparing to meet the Western oil companies and force prices up again. Delegates were still arriving on the very day that the Arab-Israeli war broke out. Two wars were being waged. one on the battlefields in the Middle East, and one in the corridors of the Intercontinental Hotel. Both were to shake the world.
October 73 is the time when OPEC alone decided on the price of oil without the oil companies.
Twos and threes would get together in somebody's suite, like Yamani's suite.
We knew what was the price of products and the price of crude oil, and we wanted to have our share as fairly as it is possible.
For us as oil men, it was the whole question of the future of Western dependency on Middle Eastern oil that was at stake.
We knew that the oil companies were going to put a stiff resistance.
We were talking about increases of 35, 40 cents a barrel.
So we asked for an increase in our prices up to $6 per barrel. We felt that this is an opportunity to wrestle from the hand of the oil companies the ability to sit with us and discuss the prices.
Nervous Arab delegates kept tuning their radios to hear the latest reports from the battlefront. For them, the news was good. Overwhelmed and fearing defeat, Israel begged President Nixon for more weapons.
The United States wanted to see Israel resupplied, but it still wanted to keep its hand hidden. Henry Kissinger told me to persuade the Israelis to unload the planes at night, and we would only bring in American airlift under the cover of darkness. The airlift was launched somewhat later than we had hoped, and instead of coming down under the cover of darkness, the first U.S. planes began to drop down into Israel in bright daylight on Sunday morning under television cameras. It was a little hard under those circumstances to keep the American hand hidden.
The tide of battle turned in Israel's favor. As talks broke down in Vienna, the OPEC delegates flew to Kuwait City. They were barely off the plane when they took a momentous decision.
We came to Kuwait, the whole OPEC came to Kuwait to discuss what we can agree on in terms of OPEC. We made the first night and we decided on two things. First, a substantial increase in price. The next day we met as Arab oil producers to decide what we could do to support the Arab side in the conflict.
In the Kuwait Sheraton, Arab exporters agreed to carry out King Faisal's threat and unsheath the oil weapon.
The battle was going so much against the Arab side, and during the latter part of that war, it was inevitable that we would use whatever at our disposal to bring to the world attention the need to address and resolve this Arab-Israeli problem. And that's when we decided to cut back on production.
The Arab oil embargo caused panic and chaos throughout the West.
Well, I live down below here. I went to 96th Street, and boy, there's a line about a mile long. So I says, I'll never get to Monroe.
In America, gasoline prices leapt by 40%.
I understand only giving $4 worth, and that's not going to give me much garbage.
Gas lines stretched for blocks.
Hey, man, I'm willing to pay for gas. You can't tell me
For the Americans, the long lines at the gasoline stations, the sense of an imperial power being challenged by these people on the hinterland of the world. And suddenly people realize that their very lives and prosperity and conveniences depend on outsiders.
The embargo produced a great shock in the industrial world. We'd had a period of sustained growth since World War II. This was the most serious blow to the world economy at one specific moment that we had seen.
Though all but paralyzed by the Watergate scandal, the Nixon White House was suddenly forced to focus on the Middle East. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger embarked on a seemingly endless round of shuttle diplomacy.
Henry Kissinger used to say that he didn't know anything about any part of the world south of the Pyrenees. He didn't care about the Third World. He didn't care about the Arab world. And he even told the Egyptians, he said, folks, I only handle crises when they're hot. Oil was hot, and oil brought him to the region. That's why he went. That's what the entire shuttle diplomacy was about, a way of ending the oil embargo.
The oil shock struck Japan. By December, oil prices had doubled again.
Facing the oil crisis of 1973, everybody in Japan sensed the country is in danger. Thus, his or her individual future is also in danger. So, something serious should be done to cope with the situation.
Naohiro Amaya became the moving force behind an extraordinary transformation of Japan's industrial strategy.
So far, the Japanese industry was heavily depending upon the consumption of oil. The Japanese government thought that the Japanese industrial structure should be reformed.
The move away from oil to a future based on computers and high technology made Japan what it is today.
The benefit of oil shock was tremendous for Japanese to wake up in understanding of the importance of the information-oriented technology.
In the rush towards energy efficiency, the Japanese put computer chips to work everywhere, even in the most humble household gadgets.
Even the washing machine, now we have integrated circuits in washing machine. So even washing machine is not just like a muscle washing the material. Delicate control. So most of the things with control, that is use of knowledge.
We are very poor of natural resources underground, whereas we are pretty rich of resources up here.
For Japan, the oil crisis proved to be a blessing in disguise. The success of today's fuel-efficient Japanese cars dates back to then.
Up until the early 1970s, Japanese cars were not a force in the world market. But when the oil crisis occurred, suddenly the emphasis on the part of people buying cars shifted from high performance and speed to fuel efficiency. And lo and behold, here were all these Toyotas and these Nissans and these Hondas that were just waiting at dockside in Japan, quality cars and cars with very high fuel efficiency. And they just moved in and captured markets in the United States and all over the world, and of course became a very powerful, if not dominant, presence in the international automobile market.
The Great Oil Shock laid the base for Japan's success today. The Japanese overcame their fear and pessimism. Cars, computers, electronics, and energy saving were to make Japan an economic superpower. Billions of petrodollars began to flow into traditional societies like Saudi Arabia. At the car auction in Jeddah, ordinary Saudis could afford to pay cash on the barrelhead. OPEC was now in the driver's seat.
New and vast wealth is now suddenly in the hands of the Arabs, and they had a sense that now all the things of the West, but not the ways of the West, mind you, just the things of the West, the machines of the West, the industries of the West, could be bought off the rack, and that all this could be the Arabs for the asking.
The oil exporters had earned $23 billion in 1972 total. By the middle 1970s, their earnings were upwards of $140 billion, a six-fold increase in their earnings.
Newfound pride brought with it a fresh determination to take complete control of their own oil industries.
In the early days, the oil companies treated the supplier nations with some degree of indifference, if not arrogance. That was resented. The suppliers felt humiliated, and they took their revenge in later years when the whip hand changed. And in those later years, it was the oil companies that felt humiliated by being forced to sit around waiting for acknowledgement of their mere presence.
We were treated with hostility. Our arguments were treated with contempt. The Kuwaitis were very tough. They wanted us out, and we assumed that we had a future together with them. We had worked with Kuwait for years, been very close to them. We had spent large amounts of money, and it was unthinkable to us that we were being thrown out.
The oil companies were trying to get over the psychological barrier, as it were, of knowing that no longer do they control the oil industry in Kuwait, that this is a new era.
When it became clear to them that the Kuwaitis were going to nationalize their concessions, BP and Gulf insisted on $2 billion in compensation. The Kuwaitis gave them $50 million.
The majors, the international companies, and the smaller companies found that they no longer had these big reserves of oil in the oil-producing countries, and so the number one issue for them became to replace those reserves, and that meant a great global oil hunt.
The companies intensified their search for oil under the deep, cold waters of the North Sea.
It was a gamble, but we knew we had a tremendous reserve there. We were lucky in one sense in that by the time North Sea oil, particularly Forties field, came onto the market, the oil price had gone up 4 or 5 times from the price at which the decision had been taken, and it transformed the industry.
Soon more oil was being produced from the North Sea than from many of the OPEC countries. Ironically, OPEC's new higher prices helped make such ventures economic.
During the 70s, when the Shah of Iran was there, he wanted to build
out of Iran a super military power in the area. He wanted to raise the price of oil for reasons other than economical reasons. The Saudis wanted to keep the price of oil going up very slightly, reasonably, so we do not hurt the economy of the West and we do not hurt the annual increases in demand.
The shock of the oil embargo and the great increase in prices drove Western countries and industrialized countries to bring into being conservation policies that before they ignored. It changed the whole situation. It reversed the power equation. And the Shah, like other rulers in the region, suddenly found himself without the kind of revenues to carry out the kind of grandiose and ambitious schemes that he saw at the beginning of the 1970s. Great increase in the price of oil, the power that oil gave, the illusion of power that the oil gave to the Shah, helped to destroy him. It was kind of a poisoned chalice for the Shah.
The Iranian Revolution exploded in all its fury and shook the world of oil to its foundations. As students and religious fundamentalists took to the streets, the system established to guarantee Middle East oil supplies was rapidly heading towards ruin.
The Shah, who had been the policeman of the region, could no longer serve that function. And when he fell, that Western influence declined seriously.
Only a handful of people witnessed the Shah's departure into exile on January 15th, 1979.
The fall of the Shah was, of course, precipitated by strikes in the oil fields that reduced Iranian production to zero from 5 million barrels a day. And it had a disconcerting effect on the oil market.
2 weeks later, 1 million people thronged the streets as the Ayatollah Khomeini, implacably opposed to the West, returned from exile and took power.
The Iranian Revolution caused the price of oil to jump several times, and the companies were panicking, and the price of oil kept going up and up again.
For Western motorists, the second oil shock was 1973 all over again. Even though he'd warned of a new energy crisis, the upheaval helped to destroy the presidency of Jimmy Carter.
Good evening. Tonight I want to have an unpleasant talk with you about a problem that's unprecedented in our history. With the exception of preventing war, this is the greatest challenge that our country will face during our lifetime. The world is not prepared for the future. During the 1950s, people used twice as much oil as during the 1940s.
I've been sitting here since 8 o'clock this morning. How about I didn't go to work yesterday because I had no gas?
During the 1960s, we used twice as much as during the 1950s. And in each of those decades, more oil was consumed than all of man's previous history combined.
The oil price actually touched $40 a barrel. Everybody thought there was now a permanent shortage of oil. But of course, with 2020 hindsight, you could look back and see that there was no shortage. There was no actual shortage. There was a panic. There was hoarding, but no shortage. But virtually no one saw that at the time.
We thought that we could get away with practically anything in terms of increasing the oil prices. I think that is when, that is the zenith of OPEC power. And perhaps at that time, we allowed that feeling of power to go into our head.
Vienna, September 1980. OPEC was meeting to plan a grand celebration of its 20th anniversary. Within minutes of its opening, the meeting broke up in confusion and OPEC's unity was shattered. Far away in Baghdad, Iraq's strongman Saddam Hussein had launched an attack on one of his OPEC brethren.
You had the feeling sitting with Saddam of being in the presence of a coiled boa constrictor who was ready to strike at any moment. But this man, very ambitious man with great designs, and with an absolute ruthlessness to carry them out, would mark Middle Eastern history very deeply.
He saw in the demise of the Iranian state and in the demise of the Shah the great opportunity for the emergence of Baghdad as the dominant power in the region and as the dominant capital in the region.
It was inevitable that somebody like Saddam would venture into adventures like the Iran-Iraqi war.
Without warning, Saddam Hussein invaded Iran.
Very much in his mind was the possibility either to control the oil fields of southwestern Iran or to destroy them, to make sure that Iran would not have the kind of power based on its oil production that Iraq would have in the future.
By disrupting oil supplies from Iran and Iraq, the war distorted the world oil market and misled OPEC.
I think, in essence, that war concealed the weaknesses that OPEC was already feeling, in the sense that the war further reduced the Iraqi-Iranian supply and gave us a misguided sense that we could continue on doing what we were doing, keeping the price of oil very high in face of falling demand.
Reasons for that fall in demand could be found in some of the remotest parts of the world. In Alaska, 3 companies, BP, Exxon, and Arco, were rushing to develop the huge reserves beneath the frozen tundra of the North Slope. It was an epic undertaking.
I think the first thing that I knew about BP in Alaska was when my old friend and colleague Monty Pennell, who was in charge of BP's exploration activities worldwide, came into our weekly meeting one morning and said, "Well, chaps," he said, "I'm afraid we've stumbled into more oil, and it's in Alaska." The immediate reaction was, hearts sank. How much is it going to cost to get it out? The Brooks Range, 9,000 feet high. How are you going to pump oil 900 miles through the permafrost and over the mountain ranges?
By the early 1980s, a quarter of U.S. domestic production, more than 2 million barrels a day, was being pumped through these pipes. The balance of oil power was shifting again.
It didn't take very long for supply and demand to catch up with the OPEC countries. They thought that they could raise the prices as high as they wanted and consumers would pay the price, but with conservation and alternative energy sources and non-OPEC oil, that didn't prove the case.
In 1983, just 4 years after the second oil shock, OPEC had to cut its prices. Oil from Alaska, the North Sea, and elsewhere was eating into OPEC's market share.
That forced them to institute quotas where they would keep their production, they said, at 17.5 million barrels a day. Just 4 years earlier, they had been producing 31 million barrels a day.
Oil prices were now established in the daily din of futures trading in New York. It was another ominous turn for OPEC.
What the quotas and the price cut really were pointing to was that control over pricing itself, which OPEC had taken in 1973, was slipping out of OPEC's hands into this so-called opener commodity market. What this really meant is that oil, which had been the great strategic commodity, was also becoming just another commodity like gold and coffee and cocoa and pork bellies.
You know, in 79, when the price of oil started to go up so highly, so many OPEC members became so intoxicated. It's a real pleasure. It's like a lady getting pregnant. That was a moment of pleasure. But thereafter, that little pregnancy brought with it pain, and the pain increased gradually until we had the painful delivery in 1986. And the price of oil collapsed.
At the beginning of 1986, crude oil prices plunged from $29 a barrel to $10. Market forces now ruled. OPEC was no longer in the driver's seat.
In 1986, oil prices collapsed. The OPEC countries found that their market share was getting smaller and smaller. Saudi Arabia was actually at one point producing less oil than the British sector of the North Sea. For the oil industry, the sudden dramatic fall in their revenues came as a great shock. And it meant that the companies went through a major and immediate crisis of contraction, of cutting budgets and cutting employment and becoming smaller companies. For the public, the price collapse was terrific. It meant that they were seeing prices that they had never expected to see again.
Price of gas down to zero.
The battle cry was sounded just after 6 this morning. Within minutes, the battlefields were packed. This North Austin service station and another on the south side went all out to win a radio station contest aimed at slashing gasoline prices. Both owners agreed to give their gas away from 6 a.m. till the stuff ran out. By mid-morning, double lines stretched more than a mile at each station. Rules of the day permitted up to 15 free gallons per car.
There was now so much oil in the world that prices were hardly affected when the long, bloody war between Iran and Iraq spilled over into the rest of the Gulf.
Since the start of the war, Iraq thought of bringing pressure against Iran by hitting their oil terminals. Iran thought of retaliating by hitting Iraqi tankers going out of the Gulf, and later tankers of other countries that were helpful to Iraq, like Kuwait or Saudi Arabia. That's why we went to the United States, to the UK, and to the Soviet Union to reflag under their national flag and get the protection of their navies.
What I think that it was an indication of the final takeover by the United States of responsibilities east of Suez. Kuwait had previously been a British responsibility.
Blood was still being shed in the Iran-Iraq war. In Tehran, they commemorated their dead with a fountain. After 8 grim years, both sides were exhausted and agreed to a truce. Ayatollah Khomeini said it was like drinking poison. In Baghdad, Saddam Hussein hailed his war as a great victory.
Despite his boast, this was not a victory. The Iran-Iraq War was not a victory for Saddam Hussein. He survived. That's the most that he can say. But it was tremendously costly. He went deep into debt. He sacrificed a lot of people to a mad ambition. The estimates of the debt that Iraq amassed during the war with Iran are in the neighborhood of $75 to $80 billion. He had mortgaged the future by conducting this war and by insisting on conducting it in the way he did.
The great gambler had to make good on the mess that he had created. Oil prices had to rise at a phenomenal rate. Other producers had to get out of his way. The Kuwaitis and the United Arab Emirates had to lower their production. The entire market forces had been disrupted, and this man had no time. I mean, he couldn't wait for a turnaround in the economic picture.
And he tried to coerce his Arab brothers into forgiving the debts. Kuwait refused. This was one of their cardinal sins in Saddam Hussein's eyes.
In the early morning hours of August 2nd, 1990, Iraqi troops invaded Kuwait. The West feared that if Saddam advanced into Saudi Arabia, he would control nearly half the world's entire oil supply. Kuwaiti resistance was snuffed out.
This was one of history's great stick-ups. This was Saddam Hussein, desperate for cash, looking around at a small, very rich neighbor.
Why do you hold up the bank? Well, that's where the money is. And that was Saddam. Kuwait was the most convenient target. It was nearby. He could squeeze it. He could blackmail it. He could frighten it into submission. And when all failed, he could walk in as he walked in on August 2nd.
5 months ago, Saddam Hussein started this cruel war against Kuwait. Tonight, the battle has been joined.
After massive aerial bombardment, the Allied forces invaded Kuwait.
If I assume that Kuwait was a small country in Africa, I don't think the United States will come all the way in order to liberate Kuwait, an African state. It's only because of oil that we had the Gulf War. As a matter of fact, oil was the reason why Iraq invaded Kuwait. And it was the reason why we had the Americans to the area with all the other Allied forces.
In less than 100 hours, the Gulf War was over. Saddam Hussein was defeated, but lived to fight another day.
The guns fell silent. What's the meaning of Desert Storm? This was an interregnum. This was a period of time between two orders of power. First, the British had been ascendant. Then came the Iranian bid. Then came the local Iraqi bid, and one of them just collapsed of its sheer weight, and one of them was defeated in war. Take a look at this 20 years between 1971 and 1991 as a time when the region was left to find its own balance, and it failed. And now the Americans are there, and they're there for the long haul. The circle is closed.
Shortly after Saddam Hussein's army invaded Kuwait, oil prices rocketed to $40 a barrel. By the time Kuwait was liberated, prices had tumbled so low that after 4 wars and 3 oil crises, the real price of a barrel was back to where it had been in the mid-1970s.
All of us had feared at some time of the whole Gulf area going up in flames, as literally it did in Kuwait. And, of course, a tremendous blow to world stability and a scramble for energy. But, of course, that instability is always present, and that's why, of course, the major oil companies are looking further and further away from the Gulf area for new supplies. In deeper waters offshore Gulf of Mexico, in Colombia, even going into what 10, 15 years ago would have been considered totally politically hostile territory like Vietnam. One is trying to get away from that Gulf tinderbox, which one can see can typically explode at any moment.